Welcome, everyone. My name is Joanne Lynn, and I am the Executive Director of the Washington Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and Urban Affairs, located in Washington, D.C. Welcome to today's virtual webinar, What to Expect for 2025, Assault on Immigrants' Rights and Civil Rights in Communities in the Washington, D.C. area. I'm delighted that so many of you could join us today for this very timely, important discussion. I'm going to be joined today by two of my brilliant colleagues, Joanna Wasik and Caitlin Banner, who are both Deputy Legal Directors at the Washington Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and Urban Affairs. I'm also joined by Ariel Derby, who is coordinating today's webinar. Today's webinar is being recorded. There will be an opportunity for you to pose questions using the Zoom Q&A function on your Zoom channels. Hopefully you can see that function. The first 20 minutes of the webinar will be dedicated to remarks by me, Caitlin, and Joanna, followed by another 20 minutes of Q&A from all of you. And with that, we'll get started. So today is January 14th. We are less than 1 week from inauguration of a new president, and we are 1 week away from what will probably be his day one executive orders, likely to focus on immigration. Today's webinar will focus on what to expect for immigrant communities and communities of color in the DMV, so in the District of Columbia, Maryland, and Virginia. Next slide. The Washington Lawyers Committee was established in 1968. So we were actually birthed at a very different period. We emerged in 1968 in the aftermath of the assassinations of Dr. Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy, both civil rights champions for the nation. And a band of private civil rights lawyers came together and made a commitment to advancing racial justice and equity for communities and families in the DMV. We have continued to do that work for the last 56 years and through 11 presidencies. Next slide. The Washington Lawyers Committee has long had a very tight association and partnership with immigrant communities and families and immigrant community organizations in the DMV. We apply multiple tools with a focus on strategic litigation, but we also engage in public policy advocacy and public education. Next slide. Our principal areas cover a wide range of issues, including housing justice, workers' rights, policing, prisoners' rights, disability rights, education justice, as well as immigrant justice. Next slide. And this is not new to us. During the Trump 1 presidency 8 years ago, Washington Lawyers Committee was very actively engaged with many of you on the call today, as well as others, in challenging several of the Trump initiatives. We worked with several community partners to represent clients in our challenge to the rescission of DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. We also sued the Trump administration for the rescission of TPS, Temporary Protected Status for El Salvador. Later in 2020, in the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd, we represented peaceful protesters who were subject to violence at Lafayette Square outside the White House when they were protesting police killings. And later in January of 2021, we went to court and sued the Proud Boys for vandalism and violent attacks against an iconic Black church here in Washington, D.C. Next slide. Fast forward to where we are today, at the beginning of 2025. We are confronting an array of threats here in the DMV. I know that these threats are known by all of you on the call, and we're going to be delving into them. They include threats of mass deportations, including separation of families, mass raids targeting work sites, homes, neighborhoods, potential immigration enforcement actions in areas that were considered sensitive in the past, such as hospitals, healthcare clinics, schools, places of worship. attacks on the District of Columbia's autonomy and ability to govern, attacks on DC public schools, including curriculum and other school policies, and crackdown on dissent generally, and also including violence against protesters here in Washington, D.C. With that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Joanna Wasik. Joanna.
Joanne. Yeah, next slide, please, Ariel. So President-elect Trump ran on a campaign of mass deportation, in fact, promising the largest deportation operation in the history of the United States. And we have heard of a myriad of tools that his administration plans to use to effectuate those mass deportation plans. One of these tools is worksite raids. Next slide. When ICE raids a workplace, undocumented workers, as well as workers with legal status, may be detained. Most often, actions by advocates, organizers, and lawyers is necessary to ensure the proper release of individuals who do have legal status, to find people who have been sent to remote detention centers. The impacts of raids are immediate, harmful, and long-lasting. They can mean children coming home from school and parents not being there, financial crisis, and other ripple effects for families and communities. So what do we know about President-elect Trump's plans so far? During the first Trump administration, the administration increased the number of workplace raids, mostly in the Southeast and the Midwest of the United States. The most frequent targets were large factory settings, manufacturing, meat and poultry plants, and there were no raids in the DC, Maryland, or Virginia region that we are aware of under the first Trump administration. From what we understand, that may be set to change. You can see on the slide two very recent news articles. The first one is from NBC News. On January 8th, NBC reported that the Trump administration is considering a high-profile showcase worksite raid in the DC metro region, potentially soon after Inauguration Day. On January 9th, the very next day, incoming border czar Tom Homan said that no such plans had in fact been discussed. So obviously we are hearing very different things in the news, but we are taking the threat seriously and the NBC report seriously. Time will tell what happens, potentially as soon as next week. Next slide. Now turning to threats to temporary protected status. Presently, 17 countries have temporary protected status, and that designation for various countries is set to expire on dates in 2025 and 2026. Also very recently, on January 10th, the Biden administration extended TPS for 4 countries whose status was set to expire in either March or April of 2025. The administration extended their TPS for 18 months. And those countries are El Salvador, Venezuela, Ukraine, and Sudan. This is particularly important in the DMV region because there are over 200,000 Salvadorans living in the DC metro region today. And according to some estimates, around 30,000 of those individuals may have TPS protections. Now, however, despite this extension by the outgoing Biden administration, we do not know what the Trump administration will do with TPS. They may choose not to extend countries when they are up for renewal, or they could even take action to affirmatively end TPS before it is up for renewal for other countries. Now, the last tool I will just very briefly mention in the administration's potential mass deportation toolbox is that the administration may seek to deputize state and local police in friendly states, so potentially more Virginia than Maryland or DC, to help with their immigration enforcement efforts. I'll turn it over now to my colleague, Caitlin. Or I'm sorry, back to Joanne.
Thank you so much, Joanna. Just continuing what Joanna just mentioned, we do expect the incoming administration to call for massive expansion of partnerships with state and local law enforcement agencies to engage in federal immigration enforcement. Here in Maryland, there already are three counties that have existing what are called 287G partnerships with ICE. 287G is just the statutory number of the immigration statute. But those three Maryland counties are Frederick, Harford, and Cecil, and they have existing 287G partnerships under the current Biden administration. I would expect to see the number of 287G agreements increase dramatically, certainly across the country, and probably also in the DMV. Under the 287G agreement, it's the state or local law enforcement agency that initiates contact with ICE and says, we would like to engage in this kind of partnership for purposes of engaging in immigration enforcement. That being said, we know that there have been strong directives and advisory opinions coming from the Virginia governor, the Virginia attorney general, calling on all state and local law enforcement agencies to cooperate with Homeland Security and ICE to the fullest extent. We do expect to see executive orders on state and local law enforcement engagement and immigration probably next week. I'm now going to turn quickly to a different category of potential tools. The incoming president has said that he wants to deport up to 1 million people a year. Tom Homan, who is a border czar named by Trump, has been on Capitol Hill in recent days talking to lawmakers and committees, explaining that he doesn't have adequate resources in terms of Homeland Security personnel and immigration detention beds to reach this number. One of the ways that the incoming presidency may seek to supplement their Homeland Security workforce is by turning to a number of military national security tools that have not previously been used for immigration enforcement. I've listed some of them here. I'm not going to go into detail on this. We have close coalition partners who are experts in these areas, but we're going to be closely watching this with respect to the executive orders that come out next week or in the coming weeks. So the incoming president could seek to invoke the National Emergencies Act, the Insurrection Act, the Alien Enemies Act. He also could call on the activation of National Guard troops, not only from the District of Columbia, but urge state governors to activate their National Guard troops to assist Homeland Security in immigration enforcement. We are closely watching that in all three jurisdictions, most closely, especially in Virginia. Next slide. I'm now going to turn it over to my colleague, Caitlin Banner.
Thanks, Joanne. So I want to talk a little bit about the threats that DC students and families are facing in the public education arena. This has, again, been something that has been a focus during President-elect Trump's and Project 2025's plans for this presidency. First, as my colleagues mentioned, we expect that we will see more immigration enforcement in places that have historically been off limits, such as schools or community centers, which we know will deter immigrant students and their families from attending school and may interfere with their right to do so. We also expect to see attacks on truthful, historically accurate, and diverse curriculum. So this may look like prohibiting DC from teaching about racial justice or critical race theory, or giving historically accurate information about things like slavery, the Civil War, or the Civil Rights Movement. We've also seen things like book banning or banning of particular information being distributed out to schools. The President-elect Trump and Project 2025 have also focused on limiting and really gutting the rights of transgender students. This will potentially look like requiring the use of students' birth names or birth pronouns unless they get parental permission, which of course could out students to their families. Also could look like banning trans people from using a restroom that matches with their gender. There's already a bill pending to do this in DC, not just in schools, but throughout the entire District of Columbia and other federal buildings. And then finally, there are real threats to the whole public education system in DC. Trump has talked about making a universal school voucher program. There is a way to do this by expanding the DC Opportunity Scholarship Program, which is our current voucher program, dramatically by increasing the amount of funding that's available and taking away restrictions on who can use that funds. And what we know is that this has the potential to drain education money and budget from our public and public charter schools here in DC. And historically, the use of vouchers has driven a resegregation of schools by both race, class, and other protected statuses. We can go to the next slide. So one of the reasons that DC education is so at risk is because the federal government has the ability to have an outsized impact on DC. They have the ability to regulate DC directly and also the ability to veto or to interfere with local legislation and budget decisions and priorities. During the campaign, President-elect Trump was focused on DC, threatening to take over DC, to restore order to DC, and to reassert federal control. This might look like a broad takeover, with Congress reinstating the control board or even trying to repeal DC home rule, which was would really limit DC's ability to make decisions for itself. It also might be more specific. So, for example, some things that the Congress has tried to interfere with in the past have included things in the areas of policing reform, racial justice, gender justice, gun control, and environmental protections. This has looked like prohibiting vehicle admission standards, allowing people to carry guns on DC's metro, defunding the Office of LGBTQ plus affairs, prohibiting racial equity training, and things like that. We also know that one of the highlights of the campaign has been focused on eliminating federal agencies and the federal workforce. This will have an outsized impact on the DC region. Trump has called for eliminating civil service protections for federal workers and relocating 100,000 jobs out of the DMV. This will have a huge impact on the DMV, not only for the people who are impacted, but also culturally, financially, and potentially having a disparate impact on workers of color, on women, and on workers with disabilities, because the federal government is one of the most well-integrated workforces. And so these layoffs may have a disparate impact on folks with those protected statuses. And with that, I think I will turn it back over to my colleague, Joanne.
Thanks, Caitlin. So the Washington Lawyers Committee has been preparing and it is prepared for 2025 and beyond. We are prepared to stand with all of our immigrant clients and communities. We will also stand with other communities in the DMV who are under attack. We are prepared to use litigation as a tool to enforce rights. We're continuing to coordinate closely with our partners, community groups, organizers, unions, schools, others in the region. Next slide, Ariel. And just to finish us out, here is our information for seeking legal assistance. We do not screen for immigration status during intakes. All intakes are safe and confidential. For general assistance, there's a link to the Get Help page. And then in addition, we run a free workers' rights clinic that is open to all residents of the DMV. We run those clinics both virtually through phone and Zoom, as well as in person in Anacostia once a month. So again, for more information, you can go to washlaw.org/clinic.
Okay, thank you so much, Caitlin and Joanna. And with that, we want to reserve the remaining 20 minutes of the webinar to hear from all of you. So there's an option to pose questions and offer comments through the Q&A function on your Zoom screen. And while those questions are coming in, we will go ahead and start the discussion. I am getting a question here about what kind of local regional coordination efforts are underway to respond to potential immigration enforcement actions. Um, Sarah or Joanna, do you want to take that?
Sure, let me start. So there are a number of hubs and coalitions that have very rapidly formed in the DC, Maryland, and Virginia regions. One of and you know WLC is seeking to be part of all of them. One of the ones that has formed is a hub called Defend DC that is led by Jobs with Justice, one of our local community partners here in the district, where a lot of service providers have come together. There are a few other spaces as well that I'll turn it over to Sarah to talk about.
Um, yes, so we are, as Joanna mentioned, we are a part of several kind of developing hubs that are forming around this issue, and are in contact with our colleagues at CASA, at LAJC, at AMICA, and other immigrants' rights focused organizations, who are currently developing protocols for responding to workplace raids, to any immigration actions from the administration. Again, as Joanna said, this is very much developing, and we are sharing resources with concerned organizations as we receive them.
Thank you, Joanne and Sarah. One of the questions that has come in is, are you seeing any specific suggestion that the protected spaces like places of worship and schools will no longer be protected against immigration enforcement? So let me go ahead and address that one. The information that we've received thus far is based on recent news reports going back to December, as well as what has been promoted through Project 2025, as well as interviews granted by members of the transition team or people who are seen as key advisors to the incoming presidency. No decision has been made with respect to the sensitive locations enforcement. And let me just review some of those sensitive community locations include hospitals, schools, places of worship. During the Trump 1 presidency, there were enforcement actions in some of those areas, but they actually left that policy largely in place. But this time around, we are hearing that there are real efforts to either completely repeal that policy or to weaken it. So we don't know yet, but I certainly think that people need to be prepared that there could be enforcement actions and arrests in places like schools, places of worship, and hospitals. And we don't share this information lightly. We know that that can engender a lot of anxiety, but we think it's better to be safe. I got a question here about the Universal School Voucher Program. Can you delve a bit more into what would happen under a Universal School Voucher Program? What is it? Caitlin, would you like to take that?
Sure. So generally, the school voucher program, both in DC and in other states, is a program that allows students to take money that would ordinarily be spent on them in the public school system and use that money towards a private school education. In DC, we have the DC Opportunity Scholarship Program, which is quite small. There's a small amount of money that is dedicated to it. I don't have the numbers at my fingertips. And there are requirements, including means testing or income testing, in order to be eligible for the scholarship program. And so there's sort of two things that have been called for in DC and sort of elsewhere. One is to dramatically increase the amount of money that is going into the DC Opportunity Scholarship Fund, and to take away that means testing, to open that up to any student in DC to take the sort of money they would have been using to go to their public school or public charter school and to enroll in a private school. There's also calls for new programs or different programs that would increase different types of vouchers or create other voucher programs in DC. And so the idea would be that anybody could choose to go to a private school. And just to highlight some of the problems that have come up with that in the past and in other places, as I said, it can cause a resegregating effect. A lot of these private schools are not regulated. Many of them are not required to follow federal laws like the IDEA or the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act. And so protections for students with disabilities are often very minimal. And so some real concerns with the increasing access to those kinds of programs at the expense of our public schools.
Thank you, Caitlin. We've received a question here about benefits and any impact that the next administration may have on benefits, for instance, such as DC paid family leave. What can be done to preserve access for immigrants for these kinds of programs? Joanna, can you take that, please?
Yeah, sure. So the question is, could those be revoked for immigrants or undocumented folks? I will admit I don't have a ready answer, but I assume the answer is yes, that it could, given congressional oversight of DC's laws and ability to, impact things like DC's paid family leave. That is, the legislation that we have here in DC. What can be done to preserve access for immigrants to these programs? Yeah, I don't think that we have a ready claim or a ready answer on this webinar. That said, we are open to coordinating with any other providers or anyone in DC who works with these communities and would like to work together to answer this question. I assume Legal Aid of DC has a lot of expertise in these benefits in particular. So I think it's a very important question and something we should all be thinking about.
Thank you, Joanna. The next question, this is for you, Caitlin. Given the possibility that schools may no longer be a protected zone, what advice do you have for schools on how they can best prepare if a parent is detained at a workplace raid and does not arrive to pick up their child at the end of the school day?
Yeah, it's an important and a sort of devastating question to have to be thinking about. So I know that there are legal services organizations, Children's Law Center, IUTA, and others in DC that are coordinating information and help for parents to get their information in order and to get guardianship and other documents in order in the event that they are swept up in some sort of immigration raid or enforcement action. I would encourage schools, to the extent they feel comfortable, to provide and share out that information with parents, to talk to parents about their plans. Schools know their communities really well, and so encouraging them to understand what help families might need or what resources they might need, and seek out sort of some of the other legal services organizations that are doing that work to help parents prepare.
Thank you, Caitlin. The next question concerns shelter and housing. Joanna, this will be for you. Do you have any suggestions on how to prepare program participants in shelter or housing programs about potential raids that ICE may enforce?
Yeah, there are a lot of organizations sharing very good resources right now about know your rights for what happens if you encounter ICE or law enforcement. That can be used to prepare program participants in shelters, other places, general community members. If you get in touch with us, we are happy to share those. There are online Know Your Rights trainings you can watch. There are materials we can share. There are handouts, and like Caitlin was saying, emergency preparedness packets that families can use to prepare their emergency plans. So I think all of those tools that are available to folks generally, whether or not families in schools or people who are in shelters or connected with other community organizations, would be useful there.
Thank you, Joanna. The next question concerns the issue of detention for people who may get arrested and swept up in ICE raids, and where people are going to actually be detained. So the truth is, we don't know. I think for people who practiced immigration law in this area, you know that there's a relative shortage of immigration detention beds for the DMV. There certainly are nearby immigration detention facilities in Virginia, Pennsylvania, but there is always the prospect and the threat that someone swept up into, let's say, a worksite raid or a neighborhood raid could also get swiftly transferred out of this region to Louisiana, Texas, or somewhere more remote. I don't have any information on this except to say that there are local community groups that are coordinating to try to be able to track people when arrests and sweeps take place to the extent possible. We want to do everything we can to make sure that people are not transferred out of the region. In large part because once they're moved away from the region, not only are they transferred away from their families, their support systems, their faith communities, but they're also likely transferred to more remote rural areas where there isn't as much access or maybe no access to immigration attorneys, Catholic charities, other types of immigration support programs. So that's something we're going to be closely watching. We'll be looking to all of you to share intelligence about where detained people may be. For those people who do find themselves getting arrested and detained, it'll be critical to try to get competent immigration counsel as soon as possible to request bond or release on alternatives to detention as quickly as possible. And there are a number of different local groups that are coordinating on immigration legal services representation. Joanna, the next question is for you. In the event ICE shows up at a workplace where they believe there may be a population of immigrants, what are the things that an employer can do to legally protect our clients, our employees? Is there anything we can share with our clients so they can protect themselves when going about their day?
Yeah, and because we've been getting so many questions where the answer is these Know Your Rights materials that are being created and the Know Your Rights trainings that are offered, potentially maybe we should think of, and I'm sort of spitballing here, but sharing with this group the resources that are already out there that answer this question. I think it's very important for people to know their Fourth Amendment rights and their other rights when encountering ICE or any other form of law enforcement, and to also know kind of the difference in the jurisdictions between what ICE can do and what local police can do. Things like your right to remain silent, your right to ask for an attorney, all of those kind of protective best practices would apply in this situation as well. So we will give it a think and think about sharing some of those resources, given that there is such a need in the questions. So thank you.
Thank you. The next question, I think also is for you, Joanna. I am hearing from community members in Anacostia that housing infractions and home purchases from non-Anacostia residents have increased since the election results. I'm also really concerned for our immigrant families in the Southeast DC who receive less information and support. Do we have any thoughts on creating a one-stop Know Your Rights one-pager to help families? I think you just answered that, but if there's anything you want to add.
No, again, thank you for the question and for identifying folks who may be the most vulnerable and in need of this information and rapidly. So while that is not something we had thought of to date, I think the questions have made clear where the need is. So we will think about sharing everything.
Great. There still is time for some questions. So if you have any questions or comments, feel free to write them in the Zoom chat. We did receive a question about how are things different now compared to 2017 in the DMV? Caitlin or Joanna, do you want to take that?
Sure. I think I will say a couple of things. I think the the leadership in Virginia has changed since 2017, and I think the approach of the Virginia government will look different than it did in 2017 in terms of protecting the rights of immigrant communities and civil and racial justice rights. I think that the administration has been more vocal about what it intends to do in DC, particularly with respect to DC autonomy, education, criminal justice, and things like that. And so I think we can expect to see a focus on that where we did not maybe have a focus on that last time, and perhaps a more prepared administration and Congress to go ahead and effectuate some of those plans, which of course is really worrisome. I think that we are also more prepared as a community. We know what's coming and we are coming together and people are ready to fight back. And so I take a lot of comfort in knowing that we have a lot of allies and co-conspirators on this call and in our communities who are ready to stand with our friends and neighbors.
Thank you, Caitlin. And I will add to that because I know that we have a number of law firm lawyers on the call today, and and we have been partnering with some of Washington's top law firms ever since early December to prepare for the impending onslaught on immigrant communities, and especially since the incoming presidency plans to use not only new tools, but also to step up and to intensify existing immigration enforcement mechanisms. So for those of you who are interested in assisting and working with us more closely, whether that's on research projects, co-counseling cases, investigations, please be in touch with us directly because the need is tremendous, and we want to be ready to respond to as many people as possible when the actions do hit. Let's see, there are a few more questions that have come in. There are a number of know your rights questions. How do we protect immigrant communities from unscrupulous attorneys who will take advantage of circumstances to defraud undocumented individuals and families? I appreciate this question because this is an ongoing threat and concern. This is true regardless of who is president, but I think particularly now at a time when so many families are going to be desperate and going to be in a place of crisis and emergency. We are fortunate that the DMV is home to many of the country's best and finest immigration attorneys. We have excellent immigration legal services through nonprofits as well as through the immigration bar. That being said, there is also a serious problem of unscrupulous, unethical practice of immigration law, sometimes by people who claim to be lawyers and they're not, and also sometimes by people who are barred to be lawyers. It's very important to get advice from somebody who is well-known, has a good reputation, and who is recognized to be a lawyer who with the requisite immigration expertise. I would encourage people to see, are they a member of the American Immigration Lawyers Association? That is the National Trade Association for American immigration lawyers. I think that that's an important question to ask. I think people should also be very wary. There are going to be promises made that if you give them, let's say, like $10,000 overnight, that they can get your loved one out of jail or, get a green card for your loved one. That may be true and it may not be true. And so this is a time to really be very, very careful and to seek assistance, especially if English is not, if they're not competent in English, it would be good to have somebody else assisting in those conversations and to find out what the extent of that attorney's practice has been. I'm sorry I don't have a more pat answer there, but this is an area where we want to make sure that people are not turning over their life savings to an attorney or a person claiming to be attorney who is not in a position to help them. Let's see. Um, the next question concerns recent shifts in the administration impacting the availability of funding and resources for nonprofits serving immigrant communities. What trends do we expect to see over the next 4 years regarding funding opportunities in this area? Caitlin or Joanna, do you have anything to say on that?
I think it's a real concern for federally funded and even local state funded uh, money that goes to serving immigrant communities. I think that this is a real call for private philanthropy to step up in this moment because we know that the need is so great. But I do think it's a real concern.
Yes, and I'll just add to that. I mean, I do know we have funders on the call, and thank you for your tremendous support of these issues. I will say that to the extent that we know that the onslaught is coming, resources are needed now. This is not a wait and see thing. This is like every single organization that's represented on this call and our community partners are already, operating in an under-resourced, understaffed, underfinanced situation. And now we are meeting the civil rights challenge of our lifetime. So we are grateful for philanthropy support, and we're asking, all the foundations and funders and donors and philanthropists to step up and to really respond soon in the new year so that all of us can be stronger and so that we can help support the immigrant families and communities who are at tremendous risk. We have time for one or two more questions. This question again, it's focused on employers. What can we as employers do to prepare for a potential worksite raid? We're working to make sure that all I-9 documentation is in order. Should we have it readily accessible on site? Is there anything else we can do proactively? Joanna, is there anything you want to add to that?
Well, I mean, I think that's a very important question, and good to hear that folks are preparing now and taking care to think about their employees and their workers in this situation. I will admit that this is slightly edging toward the outside of my expertise in terms of employer preparedness. We have admittedly been very focused on family and individual and community preparedness. I think the idea of having all your I-9 documentation in order and in one place makes perfect sense. And in addition, I would suggest designating a person who will be the liaison with immigration agents when they come knocking on the door and will represent the employer there, just to give a sense of calm and process to the extent possible to the workforce and to that very chaotic and scary situation.
And I will say that, based on my prior experience in responding to mass worksite raids, often when they kind of unfold, they involve immigration sweeps where agents will show up and they don't have a warrant for any individual. They may arrest everybody on site or everybody who looks a particular way or sounds a particular way. All of those workers are entitled to consult with counsel, and nothing should be done to impede or block their ability to consult with counsel. Whenever there are sweeps, inevitably that means that there are going to be people who get caught up into that dragnet, including U.S. citizens, permanent residents, people in lawful immigration status, including asylees, refugees, people with some type of work visa. So people should not assume that just because there's a massive worksite raid, everybody's going to get arrested and everyone's going to get detained and deported. There are often people who are U.S. citizens themselves or otherwise here lawfully, and no matter what, they're entitled to consult with counsel. I think we saw one more question come in. Okay, this question concerns undocumented students. How do we protect student data? Are we thinking about data collection and privacy? Is there something that we should do to clear records that would provide proof of undocumented status? Caitlin, do you want to take that?
Sure. I think it's a really good question. I sort of similar to Joanna, also admittedly, this is edging up on the limits of my expertise. I think all of the advice in terms of ensuring that documents are in order, that data protections are secure, that schools are following the privacy laws, such as the FERPA, the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act. Is all really good. I think also I echo Joanna's advice to employers, to schools, to really have a plan in place for how you will deal with if an immigration officer shows up or an immigration enforcement officer shows up at your school, who will handle it, taking away worry from sort of line staff or teachers or others, making sure there's a plan in place so that you know how you want to respond, I think are all really important steps.
And this will be the final question. It's very similar to what Caitlin just answered. What can healthcare workers do to protect their patients? Again, it's the same answer that Caitlin just gave with respect to schools that we were talking earlier about workplaces. So if you're a healthcare provider and if immigration agents or state and local police show up, either asking or seeking to arrest a patient or in conducting an immigration enforcement action in your offices, it's critical, first of all, that, for lack of a better term, the boss, the one who's running the healthcare clinic, immediately seek counsel from whoever their attorney is, their general counsel. That company or healthcare clinic should have done that already in advance of any type of immigration enforcement action. The people should be asked to provide warrants, targeted warrants, identifying people by name. All the regular healthcare privacy laws that apply, HIPAA and other laws still apply to people regardless of their immigration status. And truth be told, I'm guessing that many healthcare workers, probably most healthcare workers, do not know the immigration status of your patients. So I think it's very important to require that any immigration agents or state and local police agents furnish the necessary documents and that they be reviewed by your healthcare clinic or your hospital attorney before anything is turned over or any information is furnished. I know that this is easier said than done. This is difficult. And we're going to be learning as we go, which is why sharing information and intel in real time with these community groups will be vital, because we'll be learning from each other. I want to thank everyone for joining us. This webinar, we really wanted to make sure we had this first conversation a week before the inauguration. All of us are here on your Zoom screen, are available for further discussion, questions, comments, concerns. We're not going to pretend we have the answers. We don't. We're in a new climate. We're in uncharted waters. We don't know yet what the law is going to look like. But we really want to encourage people to not lose heart. There is, here in the DMV, there's a tremendous community of support for immigrant families and communities, whether they are professionals, social service providers, legal services providers, schools, places of worship, healthcare providers. There is also tremendous goodwill for immigrant communities who are working alongside us, attending school with us, worshiping with us in our faith communities. We're ready to stand and to fight, to defend our immigrant neighbors, and we need all of you to be there with us in this fight. So with that, I'm going to thank all of you for joining us, and we'll look forward to continuing the conversation throughout 2025. Happy New Year to you all. Thank you again.